It is a real pleasure for me to welcome Professor Ioana Marinescu to Iași. He is the keynote speaker for our conference. Professor Marinescu's scholarship links labor economics, antitrust, and technological change to study how market power and innovation affects wages, employment, and inequality. She has a very impressive CV, so I will have to be selective, summarizing some of her achievements. She holds not one, but two PhDs, one at EHESS in Paris, the second one from the LSE. She was a junior faculty at the University of Chicago, and since 2017, she moved to the University of Pennsylvania, where she's currently a tenured associate professor at the School of Social Policy and Practice, with additional appointments in the economics department and the Wharton School of Business. She has published an impressive number of articles, including the Review of Economic Studies and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Today, Professor Marinescu will give a paper entitled Monopoly Power in the Labor Market. We will keep the same format as yesterday. Again, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Need to lower this a little bit. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you today. So this presentation summarizes a body of work that has been done, some by myself and a lot of it by many colleagues. This presentation is based on two recent reviews of literature that I wrote with my colleague Jose Azar. The first one is in the Handbook of Labor Economics and focuses on the theory of monopsony and the estimation of the markdown, whereas the second one focuses more on policy issues that can be understood through the lens of monopsony power in the labor market. And the second one is in the Annual Review of Economics. So why does monopsony power matter? The key question here that I want to ask today is, how does competition influence wages, and why does it matter for labor market outcomes? So what are the questions we're going to be talking about today? First, what is monopsony power? How do we define it? Second, why does labor market concentration, which is one proxy for monopsony power, how does that affect wages? Third, how do we measure and interpret monopsony power? And finally, what are the implications for policy? And I'll draw there on my experience in the US government. So first, what is monopsony power? What are we talking about? So we want to measure the monopsony power through this measurement, which is the markdown. So the markdown is the gap between a worker's marginal revenue product, or productivity for short, and the wage. This is scaled by the wage. So essentially, we're asking, the worker has this productivity, they're paid a certain wage, there might be a gap. The markdown is that gap between the worker's productivity and their wage. In the perfectly competitive labor market, there should be no gap. The wage is equal, to marginal productivity. We all learned down in Econ 101. So when there is a gap, it's the markdown. So as I previewed, competition and market power is going to be really important here. And there's a recent paper by the White House where they discuss the meaning of competition. And they talk about competition being the process through which firms and individuals vie for customers, suppliers, or workers. And note there the addition of workers, as a newer addition, certainly, to the way that we think about competition. Competition, in competitive markets, you're going to have many independent rival actors. You're going to have multiple options. What are the benefits of competition? Lower prices, higher wages, innovation, business formation, resilience of the economy. And so then in that context, they define market power as the ability to shift behavior to profit oneself at others' expense. So now, this being a definition of competition, as you can see, that is broader than the markdown, The markdown then, is certainly a more limited measure. It summarizes the outcome, not the competitive process. It doesn't say, how do we get to this gap between productivity and wages? It just measures the gap. So it doesn't capture by itself all of the dimensions of labor market dynamics and strategic interactions. It's, again, a measure of an outcome. So the value of the markdown as a measure of market power in the labor market, or monopsony power, it's a concise measure of a firm's ability to suppress wages below workers' marginal contribution. So it's a snapshot, really, of monopsony power. Now let's talk about why. Why might there be a gap between the productivity of workers and their wage? So 3 reasons. The first one is oligopsony. The fact that, unlike the traditional perfectly competitive labor market, we don't have infinitely many employers, but a limited number of employers. And one way to measure that is through labor market concentration, which is essentially the number of employers weighted by their size. So that's one reason. Workers have limited opportunities in terms of the numbers of employers. A second reason is that jobs are heterogeneous, and therefore every worker has different preferences over jobs, and they don't, not every job is made equal to every other. The most easy way to see this is to think about geographic distance. So workers, it turns out, empirically really care about how far the job is from their home. Different workers live in different places. So, a job that is further away from your home is not a perfect substitute, even if everything else is the same, to a job that's closer to home. And that creates market power, because there's limited job substitutability due to the fact that jobs are made of many characteristics that people value differently. So that's a second reason. And this can occur, as we will see, even with infinite number of firms, but there is job differentiation. And finally, the third reason is search frictions. So you could have infinitely many firms, all the jobs are the same, but there is a limitation in terms of how the worker is able to shop around, if you think about looking for a job as shopping for something. And here the fundamental issue is that there is a matching function. So you're not immediately able to browse all jobs in a costless fashion. Instead, we encounter these search frictions. And that is a third reason why you can have a gap between productivity and wages. So let's get more into, this is going to be like this is the highest level of generality. Now I'm going to show you a table of these models that gives just a little bit more detail, and then I'll go more quickly through some of the equations, but in the paper, we go through the whole derivation of the theory in each of the 3 cases. And of course, you could combine them, 2 or more of them in the same model. And so here, I'm showing you, in fact, in this blue are some extensions where people have sought to combine concepts from these 3 different sources of monopsony power. So the first one that we just talked about is oligopsony, the first model. So I'm looking here at the first row. And what's the key deviation from perfect competition? Remember, perfect competition, wage equals productivity or marginal revenue product of labor. So what is the key reason, theoretically, in each of these cases why we don't have this? So in the case of oligopsony is that we have a finite number of firms with strategic interactions. So they realize that they are finite and they play an equilibrium game, and thereby optimally decide to set wages below marginal productivity. And why they can do so is because fundamentally there's a limited labor supply elasticity to the market. So this is such an important concept, especially in antitrust policy, which I'll get to later. But if we're thinking about a market like, let's say, nurses in Iași, so right here, there might be a number of hospitals and other doctors who employ nurses, and they might all realize that nurses have limited opportunities, and therefore there is the ability to pay them less than their productivity. But if the labor supply of nurses was extremely elastic, let's say the nurses could relocate to Bucharest, then these limited numbers of hospitals here couldn't easily suppress wages. So it's fundamental that workers are not elastic, or not too elastic, let's put it this way, to wages in that particular labor market. Otherwise, even though we have a small number of firms, it becomes of little relevance since workers can go outside the market and find other opportunities. Second, differentiated jobs. So here, the key is that workers have heterogeneous preferences of job characteristics. Again, I think a useful one to think about is geographic distance. Not everybody lives in the same place. They value jobs differently. And why can firm pay less? In this case, is because from the point of view of the worker, this job that's closer to home is better than the next best alternative that is further away from home, as one example, but of course it's like a space of job characteristics. And so the fundamental determinant of the markdown in this case is going to be the job substitutability from the point of workers. How substitute our jobs with each other. And in this model, you could also complexify it by also adding labor market concentration and the labor supply elasticity to the market, so thereby combining elements of oligopsony with differentiated jobs. Third, search and matching. So here, the key deviation from perfect competition is that you have search friction. So again, you're not able to immediately meet and sample all of the jobs. And that's really why firms pay less. So if you think about a model like perhaps you're familiar with random matching, you draw some firm, and right now you're only looking at this firm. You're not able to draw until you say no to this firm, the match doesn't happen, then you're back on the market and you only have a limited probability to sample a different firm. So you can see how intuitively that gives that firm that you're bargaining with right now market power, because they're insulated from the competition from other firms because of the search friction. So that's the third mechanism at play here. And what matters here for the markdown, for this gap, is your outside option, right? If I don't accept this offer, what's my outside option? The matching function, which determines how quickly I'm going to match with other opportunities, and worker bargaining power. And here too, you could mix this model with a notion of labor market concentration, which then combines elements of oligopsony with search and matching. So here I'm going to show you a few equations just to fix ideas, some of the fundamentals of these models. So in the oligopsony models, firms, which is the simplest canonical model to think about monopsony, and by monopsony, by the way, terminology, I say monopsony, but really I mean oligopsony, or there is a difference between the wage and the marginal productivity of labor. So monopsony is really a catch-all term to say that we don't have perfectly competitive labor markets. So, but this particular model, oligopsony, the firms compete in Cournot, and so what you have is that the marginal revenue product is equal to the wage plus this term here, the derivative of the wage with respect to employment times employment. And this term comes from the fact that the firm realizes that it's not infinitesimal in the market. So if it wants to hire additional workers, it needs to increase the wage to all workers, including inframarginal workers. And therefore, this introduces a wedge where the firm is less likely to employ somebody because it would have to pay everybody else a higher wage. So in the perfectly competitive model, this second term there is zero because the firm is infinitesimal. So it doesn't influence the wage in the market. It can hire however many workers it wants at the going wage, but not so in an oligopsony model. And that's really here you can see in equations, how this happens in this setup. Then the markdown, if you calculate the markdown as I defined it, the marginal productivity of labor minus the wage divided by the wage, it has a really nice expression for the oligopsony model, which is market share of that firm divided by the labor supply elasticity to that market. So to come back to my example of the nurses in Iași, if you have some hospital, it has a certain share of the employment of nurses, let's say. So you take that share and you divide it by the labor supply elasticity of nurses to, this area, this specific labor market. So that's what the theory predicts. And then if you take this the average, that's for one particular hospital in my example. If you average over all the hospitals in the area, or all the places of employment of the nurses, you obtain this expression, which is that the average, the market average, is equal to the HHI divided by, again, the labor supply elasticity to the market. And this HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, is very broadly used to measure competition, and it is micro-founded in this way. And what it is simply the sum of the square of the market shares. So thereby giving you an idea of how concentrated this market is. So that's oligopsony. Then you have differentiated jobs. I'm going to skip over this and go straight to the model to say that one way to represent this is by having just one parameter with job differentiation. So in this simple model, it's so-called monopsonistic competition. So the firms don't take into account their effect on wages, so there's no oligopsony here. Every firm considers itself infinitesimal. That's why you don't see labor supply elasticity here. So here, the markdown only depends on the theta parameter, which is the differentiation parameter. So how different jobs are from each other. When theta goes to infinity, jobs become perfect substitutes. Markdown goes to 0. You return to the perfectly competitive outcome of 0 markdown. And as I already said, it doesn't depend on the labor supply elasticity because firms here are atomistic. Then you could add in this, it's kind of neat because here you can have a simple representation within this framework. You can add both. You can now have job differentiation with the theta parameter, and you can also add oligopsony, so a limited number of firms. And so in this case, the firm level markdown is a weighted average, where the weight is the firm share in the market of the first term, which represents job differentiation, this one over theta, and the second term, which has both inverse of the labor supply elasticity to the market and the job differentiation. Then when you average this on average at the market level, you obtain a function of HHI, again, like we had before. And this formula shows you that concentration, as measured by HHI, is more important whenever labor supply elasticity is low or job differentiation is low. So it also kind of shows you the relative importance, certainly within this model, of concentration versus job differentiation. And finally, you can have a search model, and those, by the way, are much harder to work with as far as finding neat expressions for the equilibrium outcomes. And so I showed you here one version of it, which isn't even an exact derivation, it's only approximately right. But here the markdown, so here in this formula, A is productivity, B is the workers outside option. Remember in search and matching model, it depends on the workers outside option. So A is productivity, B is the workers outside option, and fundamentally this lambda over delta term is the expected number of competing firms. So this element is similar to concentration. Like how many firms can you expect to get an offer from? That determines the markdown in search, and you can see that this is closely related intuitively to search frictions, right? So how insulated is each firm from competition depends on how many offers you can expect to get in the next period. And why is this ratio? Because the lambda is the offer arrival rate and the delta is the job loss rate. Any job, you could still lose it, and then you could have an offer at the same time. So, in this random search model, you can actually also introduce concentration, and there is this paper by Jarosh et al. That shows that you can nest an idea of concentration here by saying that in a more concentrated labor market, you're of course more likely to meet the firms with the highest market share in random search, right? So if you sample randomly and the firm has a high market share, you're more likely to sample that firm. And that it ends up, of course, giving the firm, I think you can see that, higher leverage in bargaining. The reason is if I refuse your offer today and I'm likely to get you again as a bargaining partner tomorrow, I can threaten you that if you don't take my offer today, you're out tomorrow as well. And through that, the large firms can impose a markdown in this kind of market when you have a limited number of firms. And I'm going to skip over, let me just say that this model is a directed search model. So now it's not random, it's directed, meaning that we post wages and then workers apply as a function of the wage that you're advertising as the firm. And what's interesting in this model from my perspective is that in this case, monopsony power could increase employment while decreasing worker welfare. So I haven't told you this, but in the classic oligopsony model, usually monopsony power is going to decrease employment relative to the competitive level because employers don't want to hire more workers so that they can keep the wage down. If they want to hire more workers, they have to increase the wage to attract more workers, but they'd rather keep fewer workers who have a higher markdown. It's more profitable than to hire more workers. But here in this model, you could have a situation where monopsony power would increase employment. And why this could happen is because if wages are low, in this model there's a vacancy posting margin. So workers are cheap. Hooray, we're going to post more jobs. And in this model, since workers have a fixed outside option that is the same for all workers, the workers accept. As long as it's above the outside option, and the firm posts a vacancy, the worker is going to take it. So in this model, you can have a situation of a labor market that has high levels of employment, but very low wages. And on average, for the worker, it's a worse situation from the worker welfare perspective than the opposite of having somewhat higher wages and higher unemployment. So that's an interesting situation that could arise. All right, so I'm not going to go through the details here, but in the paper we show you the formula in every simple model case for the firm level elasticity of labor supply, the market level elasticity, and then the markdown, both at the firm level and the average markdown in the market. So what I want you to notice from this table, without going into the details, some of these formulas I have already shown you, is in red, you have across models an element where firm size matters. Or the number of firms, the notion of the number of firms. Whether it's through HHI or in the case of search models, it can be through the expected number of job offers that you're going to have. So in every case, markdown increases when you have fewer firms or more concentration or lower probability of getting an offer. All right, so that was the theory overview. 3 sources of monopsony power again. Oligopsony, having few firms. Secondly, job differentiation. Not every job is the same in the eyes of every worker. Third, search friction. So those are the three reasons. Now, I want to zoom in for a moment on concentration because that's a common measure that's easy to measure, and I've contributed this literature showing how you can measure it, and it's widely used also for enforcement in antitrust policy. So, I've done this, you can regress wages on concentration, but of course that's an equilibrium outcome, as I hope you understood a little bit from my theoretical explanation. So one important caveat here that one has to keep in mind is that the theory clearly says that if you have higher concentration, you should have, all other things equal, that's key, higher markdown. All right? But if you're comparing different markets or potentially the same market over time, you could also have changes in productivity. So in the real world, you could have, it's easier to think about 2 markets, A and B. In market A, there's high concentration, but productivity could be really high. For example, there's some superstar firms that are extremely productive. They have a high markdown because they have a high market share, but the wage level, despite the markdown, is still very high because it's very productive. So essentially, you could think about, software engineers. They get paid a lot, but they could still be very much underpaid relative to their value to the firm. And then you could have some other market that is much more competitive, but the productivity of workers is lower. So, cashiers, something like that, it might be very competitive, but the productivity of the workers is lower, so they have lower wages, even though the gap is lower. So we must not confuse the markdown, which is a gap between productivity and wages, with the level of wages. So we have to be a little bit careful in what exactly we're comparing when we're doing empirical work. So, of course, you can achieve that through thinking carefully and adding the right controls, but I just want to caution you that it's not the same to have a high markdown and a low wage, since you could also have differences in productivity. Next, I want to talk about the normative implications here. When you have higher concentration, I gave you the example, for example, of very concentrated, perhaps, market with superstar firms, perhaps that are very technologically advanced. You could have, therefore, high concentration, high levels of markdown. So workers are underpaid relative to their productivity, but still wages are high. And therefore, overall welfare could be very high in that world, right? So we have highly productive firms, high concentration, wages are high, welfare is high. So it's not necessarily the case that you have lower welfare. And in fact, there could also be cases where also product market concentration could benefit workers. So this is just a caution that while generally speaking, it is correct to think that higher levels of concentration increase the markdown and through that could harm workers. You have to think about the broader picture when you're comparing different situations. This being said, I also want to say that concentration as market power has broader effects beyond how it affects wages. So it's not just all about the wage level. So first of all, there's growing literature in political economy that such concentration, so having a small number of firms, can distort the political process, for example, through lobbying. And so that has important effects that we have to take into consideration. And secondly, concentration can increase income inequality, in particular between the owners of capital and labor, which can have adverse welfare effects depending on the social welfare function and how much weight we place on inequality, for example, through positional externalities. All right, so this is the end of my theoretical overview. Now I want to talk to you about how big is this markdown. So I'm saying there could be a gap between wages and productivity for a number of different theoretical reasons, but empirically, how big is this gap? So there are three key empirical approaches in looking at the markdown. The first is going to be a reduced form elasticity of labor supply estimate using a quasi-experimental variation. Remember that with the elasticity of labor supply, you can figure out what the markdown is under those formulas. Second, you can have industrial organization types of methods with structural estimation. And third, you can have the production function approach. And I want to point out that this third approach is very helpful because it looks directly at the firm level. It tries to measure the marginal productivity of labor and the wage and then measure the gap. So in a way, it's more direct than measuring the labor supply elasticity. But the downside is measuring the marginal productivity of labor in the real world, in a real firm, is quite difficult. So there are econometric issues and different data requirements and econometric issues in doing one versus the other, but we'll see that the results we get are broadly in the same ballpark. So it's fairly reassuring that the literature is consistent across different methodologies. So this first table, again, no need to read the details, it's in the paper, but summarizes the papers that estimate the labor supply elasticity and the markdowns through that. So I want to just look at the last column there for the estimated markdowns. So there is some variability across studies, but here, most of the studies find a markdown between 20% and 40%. So a reminder of what that means. That means a markdown of 20% means if we could completely eliminate the gap between productivity and wages, going all the way to the competitive wage level, wages would increase by 20%. That's what the markdown means, right? So that's what we get from this particular methodology. Secondly, using structural estimation, and the first paper on this list is one of my papers, where we use data from an online job posting and data on applications to understand workers' preferences for differentiated jobs and then infer markdown based on that. So here, and there's other papers doing related things using structural estimation. Here, again, across these different papers, if you look at the estimated markdown, it's roughly in the ballpark, again, of about 20%. Again, meaning that if you were able to completely close the gap and return to competitive wages, wages would increase by about 20%. Finally, in this last table, I'm showing you a bunch of additional results that give you yet other estimates of the markdown. The bottom three are all production function approach. So again, the particularity of this approach is that you actually take firm data, usually in manufacturing, actually try to estimate the marginal revenue product of labor, and then compare that with how much people get paid, which, as I said, actually has some pretty complicated econometrics behind it. But the bottom line is there's some variation, but the markdown there is between 16% and 50%, roughly speaking. And again, this markdown, for example, there 50%, that's in US manufacturing. So this would imply that in US manufacturing, if you could completely eliminate the markdown and put wages to the competitive level, wages would increase by 50%. Okay? So to summarize then, what have we learned from all this burgeoning literature? There's a lot of papers in recent years. The literature typically finds markdown somewhere between 15% and 50%, which means that all other things equal, wages would increase between 15 and 50% if you could completely eliminate monopsony power and return to a competitive wage. I do want to point out for everyone here that obviously this is an extreme outcome, and it wouldn't be reasonable to expect to be able to do that, for example, because there's always going to be some residual job differentiation. There's no escaping that jobs are not the same as every other job, so you realistically couldn't obtain quite this size of an effect. But going all the way there, this is how much you could increase wages by eliminating the imperfect competition in the labor market. All right, so that concludes my overview of what is monopsony power. We measure it with the markdown. What is the markdown? We saw the markdown is between 15% and 50%. Now let's talk about implications for policy. If we know this, how does that change our way of thinking about various policies? So in our review of various policies that are relevant when we think about imperfect competition on the labor market, we break them down into three broad categories of policies, and then we show you the three causes of monopsony power and whether this policy has been studied through that angle. So antitrust policy is one of the policies at stake here. Then there's the kinds of policies, secondly, that affect, in general, barriers to switching job. And finally, there is a set of policies at the bottom there, which are direct interventions to increase job quality. So those policies, like the minimum wage, they don't directly stimulate competition in the labor market. They don't do anything to address the underlying causes of monopsony power, but they just address the outcome. Wages are too low, so we're increasing them. So those are, in that sense, different approaches. While all of the policies above get at some element of why wages are too low, for example, because there's barriers to switching jobs and so on and so forth. So if we can address that, we can, reduce the markdown. And here I'm going to focus, why it's red, for this talk, I'm just going to focus on three areas where we have the most empirical evidence: mergers, non-compete agreements, and the minimum wage. So when it comes to mergers, we can identify the impact of concentration, HHI, on wages using mergers. So as you remember, in oligopsony and some search models, you have that the markdown depends on HHI. So mergers can help as a quasi-experiment to assess these HHI effects. Because when two firms merge, their market share grows, since now instead of, 20% and 30%, now they have together 50% market share after merging, if nothing else changes. So that's a shock to concentration, and with that we can assess the impact of concentration on wages. So what do we find? First, just in general, the literature, including my own, finds that higher concentration is linked to lower wages. Not focusing on mergers specifically, but just in general, there is this stylized fact that the higher the concentration in a market, the lower the wages tend to be. But again, as I explained to you, there might be some, omitted variable bias. So, and that's a potential fragility of that literature. So mergers are interesting, again, as a quasi-experiment where we can shift concentration. And two very nice papers find that mergers that significantly increase concentration also reduce wages, and that it's related to the increase in concentration, thereby validating the oligopsony model that says that the more concentration we have, the lower the wages, while mergers that create greater amounts of concentration decrease wages more than mergers that create less effect on concentration. What about non-compete agreements? So these agreements are contracts whereby the worker agrees with the employer, agrees, that's in the contract, so worker usually signs that blanket with everything else, but the idea is that after the job is finished, the worker cannot go work for a competitor. This is very common in many professions, but in particular for doctors in the US, I don't know here, you cannot work for any other hospital in some radius after you leave your employer, usually for a certain period of time, like 2 years. Obviously, that reduces the options for workers, and you'd expect that to lower wages. And in fact, the literature does find that these kinds of contracts consistently tend to reduce wages. They also have disproportionate impacts on women and non-white workers. And just as one example, the state of Hawaii banned these kinds of contracts, and this led to a 4% wage increase for affected workers. This was for tech workers. And finally, one interesting aspect is that it's not just about workers. There is now research looking into the broader effects of non-competes, and in particular showing that it can harm business growth and consumer welfare. And why it can harm business growth, that's really interesting, because the worker, in particular high-skilled workers, might be really desired by some competing firms. Like, let's say a new tech firm sets up and they want a highly competent CEO, but this CEO might be bound by a non-compete, so they cannot hire away said CEO to help them grow because the CEO has a non-compete. And so that's the fundamental mechanism through which non-competes can harm business dynamism. And there's a really neat paper by Shi on this in Econometrica. All right, so lastly, the minimum wage. So if you have monopsony power, we're no longer in Econ 101, so you can't necessarily expect that putting on a minimum wage is going to decrease employment, since remember, with markdown, you have productivity and wages are below. So if you increase wages a little bit, it may not necessarily harm employment. There's a cushion of the markdown. And in fact, what we find empirically in my own work published in the Review of Economic Studies is that you actually see positive employment effects of the minimum wage in markets that are highly concentrated, and negative employment effects in markets that are not concentrated, that are more similar to the Econ 101 competitive labor market. There's a paper by Dustman and co-authors showing that monopsony helps explain why the minimum wage doesn't reduce employment when jobs are differentiated. And finally, by using this framework, you can actually compute the optimal minimum wage that balances various considerations, and in particular monopsony. And so in this paper, they did a calibrated model and figured out the optimal minimum wage for the US, which I think was $15 per hour. So So in the last part of the presentation, and I'm going to make that quick so that you have some time for questions, I want to talk about my experience in government. I was the principal economist at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division in the US between July 2022 and June 2024. So how did this come about? So, you saw that I've done, this was, in academia, this was a hot topic. There's been a lot of work on it, including my own and that of many other colleagues. So the Biden administration at the beginning has really focused in general on competition and more particularly on competition in labor markets. So there was an executive order in 2021 that was titled Promoting Competition in the American Economy. And there was a whole subsection on labor market competition. And so, following that, Tim Wu, who was Biden's administration's National Economic Council Special Assistant, he led, this report and interviewed me about monopsony power in the labor market. So they called me up and they're like, okay, help us understand, what is monopsony, how much monopsony is there, what can we do? So that's, how I got in contact with the administration, and eventually one thing leading to another, I was offered a job to actually implement competition policy in the antitrust department, which was really amazing. And there, I was overseeing as the head, together with Susan Athey, of the expert analysis group. This is a group of about 50 PhD economists who do all the analysis work that supports the antitrust cases of the Department of Justice. And so our role is to essentially oversee that kind of like a lab, help people, giving them feedback and then making strategic decisions about enforcement, whether we should sue this firm or not, together with the lawyers. So based on the economics evidence, based on the understanding of the law, together, we decide what to do about various cases. So I worked on many cases like Google trials, Apple trials, and of course, issues of monopsony. So one of the things that we did while I was there, this case was finishing up when I joined, but this was a merger that was proposed between two of the largest publishers in the world, Penguin and Simon & Schuster. And we argued that this merger was going to decrease authors' pay. We said for this, there are only 5 large publishers that publish big books, bestseller kind of books. So if you're that kind of author who has a potential bestseller, there's only 5 publishers you can go to. And 2 of them, the largest ones, decided to merge. And we argued and we made projections of how much the pay of authors was going to go down. And that convinced the judge to block the merger. And ultimately, the parties decided not to appeal and the merger was just done with. It didn't happen. So that was the first time that we won a case only on the basis of monopsony power, arguing that such concentration would adversely affect authors. And in our paper, we have a more detailed description of this case. The other big thing that happened while I was there is that we did the new merger guidelines, so the 2023 merger guidelines. So the merger guidelines, in general, their goal is to inform the public and firms and the courts about what the agencies consider when reviewing a merger. So which merger the agencies, the antitrust agencies, will think is legal and which merger is not. And so since 1982, these merger guidelines have mentioned competition among buyers, and of course employers or buyers of labor services, but it wasn't explicitly flagged as labor or workers, just saying, also we must preserve competition among buyers. And now in this new edition that I have worked on, we have labor markets being explicitly discussed in the whole guideline dedicated to labor markets, guideline 10. And there again, you can read more in this other paper we wrote about that. And so the point here is that this reflects economic learning that I told you about before, understanding that imperfect competition in the labor market is important and needs to be addressed through policies. And one of the important pieces of the merger guidelines is that the agencies say we will evaluate the impact on labor as a standalone basis to challenge a transaction. What does that mean? We don't need to prove that it negatively affects consumers. If we can show that it's going to negatively affect workers, that's enough for the merger to be blocked, and that's what happened in the case of the publisher merger. Of course, authors are not workers, strictly speaking, but they provide labor services to the publishers. So I'm going to skip on that. If you want to, there's some things that didn't work out. Now we have a new administration. A lot of things have changed, but one thing that didn't change is that they are committed to pursuing antitrust cases that are in the labor market, and they say that's one of the lines of continuity with the prior administration. The guidelines are still there, so this is something that, at least at the general principle level, this administration is committed to continuing. And also, there's a lot of such enforcement around the world, including in Romania, where the competition authority here is more and more often looking into cases, in particular, of collusion in the labor market, where employers agree with each other either to literally fix wages to keep them low, or not to hire each other's employees, which is called the no poaching agreement and is an antitrust crime. And the reason is that it's essentially what we call market allocation. It's like, these workers are mine, these other workers are yours, we're not going to touch it. No competition between us for these workers. So to conclude then, we have first the evidence. We have finite labor supply elasticity, we have market concentration, we have job differentiation, we have search frictions. All of these are present in the real world and lead to monopsony power or a markdown in the labor market. We have robust empirical evidence across sectors, settings, time, and countries that the markdown is substantial, so wages would increase between 15% and 50% if monopsony power could be completely eliminated. Third, policy matters. We've seen that antitrust enforcers are onto this topic with the 2023 merger guidelines in the US and Guideline 10. There's been efforts to regulate the use of non-competition agreements and, of course, the minimum wage as a tool to fight low wages. So generally, we can see a significant amount of continuity across administrations in the US. I should also say that some of the enforcement started under Trump 1. So it's something that has grown over time across administration. So it has bipartisan roots as well as momentum. And furthermore, this is an area of enforcement for competition authorities that is growing around the world, including in Romania. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.